Hey guys, Argent here. I know I put up a character profile today, and I just put up an extra reactionary review of the Revenant. As I've said before, I have a schedule now which I will keep to. However, movies I see that are still in theaters, some requests and live streams are kind of exempt from that. Just because I have basically things queued up for the next couple months because I'm crazy and I just make a lot of stuff. Some of it doesn't really take that long, like character profiles I normally think about when I'm doing something else, and I can normally record them in one or two takes. Um, but for movies like this, if they're still in theaters, I kind of feel like I should put them out as soon as possible, so if people want to go see them, they can get my take on it. So yeah, just a little housekeeping. So The Big Short, based on the Michael Lewis book, I believe it is. Um, what can you say about The Big Short? I really liked this movie. I went to see it just because I thought it was kind of an interesting premise. Um, I kind of like films about the housing crisis. Maybe this will sound weird to a lot of people. I actually liked Capitalism: A Love Story. Even if I didn't agree with all of it, Michael Moore is actually normally a pretty good filmmaker. His new movie looks absolutely awful. Who should we invade next? But I actually thought Canadian Bacon, Capitalism: A Love Story, Sicko, and Fahrenheit 9/11. Even if they were like outrageously left wing, I actually thought they were like well made as movies. They were like funny. Particularly Fahrenheit 9/11, which I think was his best film. But I just bring that up to say that even if I don't agree politically with a movie, I like to think normally I can look at it on its own merit. And in this case, I actually did agree politically with this movie. So The Big Short follows four sets of people, or maybe five, depending how you want to look at it, um, who crisscross a bit, but largely it's about the lead up to the financial crisis. And it follows kind of the four groups of people who saw it coming. So we have Christian Bale, who plays an autiste, a literal autiste with one eye. He has a glass eye, who runs a I'm trying to think, an investment fund, a hedge fund. He runs his own fund called Scion Capital, and he's really big into Metallica, loud heavy metal music, um, all kinds of stuff. And he basically the film starts with him. I won't say everything about the plot because this is more of a film of ideas. Although the narrative isn't bad really. So he's basically looking at I'm trying to think how to call it, the mortgage market, and I'll get to explaining how the whole thing works because this film actually does explain the housing crisis in a pretty accessible way. Um, Even when it's not accessible, the film pokes fun at it. It's a very self-aware movie. They frequently have like just kind of almost quirky cutaways where they have like there's one where I forget her name, the actress from what was that film, The Wolf of Wall Street, who plays his wife. It cuts to her in a bath in like a bubble bath, explaining what something is. And there's another scene where Selena Gomez just comes in and explains something. Um, and if it's still really unclear, they're like, "Don't feel bad if you can't understand it. It's just bullshit." So that's pretty funny. The film's self-aware. It does actually, I think, explain these complex financial things pretty well. Some people might say the film is a bit of a straw man. I thought it in general, it kind of had to be because finance is very complicated and there's all these like terms and stuff. Um, I don't mean to sound like a pleb when I say that, but I've tried to figure this stuff out from time to time. I kind of understand economics. That makes sense to me. Wall Street finance though is kind of I don't get it. I'm very old fashioned when it comes to investments. Yeah, but so Christian Bale's character is basically looking through the mortgage market, um, and I guess to explain this, I have to explain kind of how the housing crisis happened, and then I'll get into the story a bit. So basically, the film starts off by telling us that back in the day, investing used to be really boring. They used to try to sell bonds, maybe some kind of boring blue chip stock, etc. But there's a big financial innovation, which was the mortgage bond. Now, how I understand mortgage bonds is the government or a company or something puts up bonds and people buy them. And they put up bonds to raise money or to raise capital for projects. Like maybe a corporation is, I think it's an alternative to stock because the company can raise money without giving away part of itself. It's basically a loan, kind of a more formalized loan that can be done en masse. So let's say General Electric wants to open a new washing machine factory and they don't have the capital for it. They might issue $10 million in bonds, which people will buy. And the bonds will pay out a rate of interest as a return for the money invested. Because once they get the factory going, they'll be making profits from it, and the company will use the profits to pay it back. Or they'll pay it back over time using profits from elsewhere. So basically, it's a way for companies to raise money without kind of selling off part of the company in the form of stock. So, I mean, that makes sense. That's pretty straightforward. And the government will do that too. And ostensibly invest the money in things like infrastructure or things that will grow the economy. And by growing the economy, it increases tax revenues and it'll increase their ability to pay it back. I think part of the reason, there's a bunch of monetary policy reasons. But in essence, that's how I understand a bond. So they came up with the idea of banks used to have all fixed rate mortgages. So you take out your $500,000 mortgage at a 2% rate of return and you'd pay it off over a long period of time. Banks liked this because while the 2% wasn't great, when inflation was low, it was a steady source of income. Generally speaking, how I understand banks work is people deposit their money in the bank, and the bank lends that money out in the form of mortgages. Now, because they only need to keep 10% of the value of their liabilities, for every like dollar people put in the bank, they can lend it out $10 of mortgages. I know that's not the exact number, but you get what I mean. And then they pay you interest on the money because they're using that money for loans and other capital producing things. So the bank said, well, this isn't really making us enough money. So what we'll do is we'll bundle a bunch of mortgages together and we'll issue bonds on behalf of those mortgages. So they'll have like, I don't know, like 100,000 houses, and then the bank will raise additional money by selling bonds on that. So they will pay the bonds interest based on the mortgages. So people are paying their mortgages, so they'll take a bit of that and the profits from the interest and use it to pay off the bondholders, but they can use the money from the bonds to buy more houses. And it allows them to kind of expand faster. It provides more capital for housing construction, and it just was kind of an efficient way of making money. And real estate is, generally speaking, a pretty safe investment. I mean, even if the market goes down, people are always going to need to live in houses. People normally will pay their mortgage before just about anything else. Particularly back in the day when requirements were more strict. You used to have to do a lot of credit checks. They used to have to make sure you had the ability to pay your mortgage, like look at what your salary was, make sure it wasn't more than a certain portion. You used to have to put down a significant amount of money as kind of collateral. So if you put down 10% of like 300 grand, we'll say, that's 30,000, and if you default, you lose that money. So putting down a large principal, first it showed that the person had the ability to pay, and second it showed that it had skin in the game. Because if you don't put any money down, who cares if you default? If you're some deadbeat, and I don't mean that to be mean, just if you don't really make it, like if you're working a minimum wage job, you have no assets, and you take out a 0% down mortgage, you might go bankrupt if you default on it, but it's not really, you don't have skin in the game. There's not really nearly as much incentive not to. So what the banks started doing over time is initially most of these were AAA. That is, like maybe a doctor or a teacher or a factory worker, someone with a secure job that paid them uh, enough money to always pay their mortgage, essentially. So that they used to be full of that, and the banks were making money. But then they said, we have so many houses together, it spreads out risk. Because if you have like 100,000 houses in the mortgage, what are the spread out across the country? What are the odds that they're all gonna default at the same time? It's basically zero. So they said, well, why don't we take some crappy mortgages, some higher risk people, and we can like shave off the top. So instead of being say 100% good creditors, we'll put in 90% bad good creditors and 10% bad creditors. It still will not cascade. It still will not collapse because we still have the rest of the people to hold it up. And over time, they kept increasing that. They kept reducing the number of good loans. Do a little. Sorry, I'm not the best at this, but let's say initially you had one mortgage bond fund that was worth that had 100,000 houses in it, and you split it up in 100,000 good loans, and you split that up into 10, and you fill the remainder with bad loans. So now you have 1 million houses in housing bonds to sell. You have 10 different funds. Um, and you can make 10 times as much money by people investing in it. So they did that, and they went further to that till it got down to maybe 1 to 5% decent loans, and the rest were initially kind of borderline. But over time, what they did was they just had a bonanza. They paid mortgage brokers huge bonuses to sign up as many people as possible. And this is, I'm not really talking about the story too much, but this all happens in the movie. A lot of the movies explaining this stuff. It's kind of a docudrama a bit. A lot of it is the various people investigating and find this stuff out. Like they go to Florida at one point, and they find out that like one stripper they talk to has 5 houses, because they stopped doing credit checks. They stopped requiring any money down, and people were selling mortgages who had no background in finance. So kind of traditionally how it worked is you try to find someone who had a job, maybe preferably a family, and get them to pay for it. But get a mortgage, and the bank would know that they'd pay it off, or at least if it implies risk of a bond. So they found they were just selling, so if they could get one stripper to buy 5 houses, that's 5 houses they can put into a mortgage bond. And the more houses people buy, the more they are able to basically just make these bond folders bigger and bigger. So let me try to think of how to explain this. So they did that, and part of how they enticed people to get it was they would offer no interest, or like 1% interest for the first couple of years. They'd say you don't have to make payments on it for a couple of years. And a lot of people were like, this is the American dream. I'm paying virtually no interest on this. Not only am I paying virtually no interest, but but in addition to paying no interest on anything, I also don't really have to make any payments on this, so I might as well buy more stuff. And people were getting into speculate. Illegal immigrants were getting in on it. They did no background checks. Basically, a lot of high time preference people just bought houses en masse, and they were kind of lied to by the mortgage brokers. Now, what happened during this was they basically created an incentive system where people got money bonuses for creating more of these like super bonds, and so they would be paid like $1 million for taking maybe one that has 2% good loans, splitting it in half, and putting filling the other 1% with 99% bad loans. So that was kind of the incentivization. So we have, and I mean that's kind of the issue with money. It's often kind of imaginary. Because if let's say you have a house that's worth $300,000, that is an asset. That is something tangible that's worth something. Let's say you have someone who has a $300,000 loan they're never going to repay. That's not real money. That's just kind of a fraud. So what the banks would do is they would get these bonds together, and then they'd immediately sell them and they'd get the money for them, and they'd offload the responsibility for the defaults onto someone else. But the idea was that they could keep the system going forever. And there's a scene where they go and talk to one of the ratings agencies, who's the ones who assign credit ratings to these. And the credit ratings, for all the super bond, kind of the bond collective things, were AAA, the highest credit rating. Now, why is this? The reason this is because if they don't give them a good rating, then they'll go to their competitor. Yes, they're competitive rating agencies. So if one person gives them like an A or something lower, then they'll go to the other agency, and the other agency will, as part of the competition deal, give them the max rating. So basically, none of the people who were checking this did anything to. They never looked at it. They just stamped it with AAA. So the idea was, because they were doing this, because all the incentives were to keep this going. The whole idea was that they could keep this going forever, because no one really saw it coming. So what Christian Bale's character, the autist, does is he actually pulls up one of the super kind of mortgage bonds, and he looks through all the individual loans, and he says no one in this is making payments. This whole thing necessarily has to collapse because no one has any idea what the fuck they're doing. None of these people are capable of paying the money off. So he spent all his firm's money to bet against it. Now, what's his name? The guy from Drive. Ryan Gosling's character catches wind of this, and he goes to Steve Carell, who runs another medium-sized fund, I guess you could say, and gets him to invest his money in this. So what they did is, I don't know how shorts work exactly, but I've tried to look it up, but I find it confusing myself. But basically, in essence, they bet against the housing market. They bet that it would crash. Because it hasn't crashed in so long, and because the banks were all invested in keeping it up and they thought the party would never end, they were given absurd odds. So if the housing market crashed, they would be paid 20, 50, 100 to 1. So if they put in like $50 million to bet against the housing market, they get paid like $500 million, which is wound up happening. So there's all these people who did the investigation, did the groundwork, and found out the whole thing was a shell game, and they made hundreds of millions of dollars off of it. And that's where the title comes from, The Big Short. Now, what happened with the banks is this whole thing came tumbling down, because eventually the banks had to start foreclosing on the houses, and as Christian Bale's character pointed out, because they issued so many of these loans with the fixed, the absurd, the unrealistically low interest rates or unrealistically low payments at the same time with the same kind of sunset, all the money came due at about the same time, and all the interest rates came up at the same time, and they foreclosed on millions of houses within the space of a couple weeks, and that started a cascading chain reaction, and more foreclosures happened, and more loans came due, and all these funds just came crashing down. All the mortgage bonds basically crashed because everyone kind of saw the emperor had no clothes, and then that led to a panic, etc. Now the banks had been in bed with the government, so they knew that the government would bail them out. So the government basically wrote off all their bad stuff and compensated them the value of the bad loans. And in the end, there was basically no consequences for any of this. From what I saw, I forget the amount of money. It was like equal to the amount of money that was lost during the financial crisis. Was the equivalent of China, Japan, the EU, and America's economy within the span of about a month. And that had a rippling effect that did damage to the rest of the economy. And it was kind of cataclysmic. And what happened after that, and this is just kind of my basic understanding of it, was that because the government bailed them out, and they didn't really do much to prevent this, because politicians are paid a lot of money to not prevent stuff like this from happening. Oh, and part of the thing was that the SEC had its budget drastically cut, and they were being paid by the banks at the same time. So because there was no incentive to not do this again, the bank executives took the bailouts, gave themselves huge bonuses, and so they gave themselves huge bonuses. And they just went back to doing basically what they were doing with very little in the way of oversight. I think only one person went to jail, despite the fact that they had basically corrupted large segments of society. They had violated millions of ethics laws, all that other stuff, and they were bailed out by taxpayers' money. I think I haven't seen the actual, been able to find the stat. I remember in one of his videos, Ramsey Paul said 90% of the population was against the bailout, or 98% was against the bailout. It happened anyways. The whole thing was just a disaster. My understanding at the moment is the only reason that this is still continuing is that the Federal Reserve just prints money and uses it to offset the losses from the banks or underwrite them. It led to the closure of Lehman Brothers and devastation to the other banks. Um, there was talk about breaking up the oligopoly of banks. There was talk of putting stuff in place to reduce the risky behavior. I mean, there's a lot of other aspects to this. I found it hard to understand. Um, Basically, I think there was like something with Selena Gomez where they're trying to explain that there could be $100 million um, housing bond, and then people would bet that it would be stable, and then people would make bets on bets and bets on bets on bets, and it got to the point where like an asset that might be worth $100 million would be worth several $1 billion, just because of all the bets on top of bets. And keep in mind, the $100 million asset isn't real because it's all based on these shit, as they called it in the movie, mortgages. So that's my understanding of the financial crisis. So the collapse of the housing market and just the disruption that caused, and the closing of so many banks, just because banks are needed for credit and stuff, and the fall in the stock market hit everything else. And because America has such a dominant economic position, it did severe damage to the rest of the world. In a lot of cases, it kind of exacerbated uh, massive financial irresponsibility in other countries. Japan is pretty financially irresponsible given the amount of debt they have. Most European countries are among the most financially irresponsible countries on earth. Um, it dried up a lot of capital that would have been spent on worthy projects, and the economy has not recovered fully from it. So that's kind of my understanding. I know I didn't talk too much about the movie, but the movie's pretty good. Steve Carell does a good job. I thought all the actors were good. I don't really have too much to say about that. I thought it was a good story, good actors, and it really did a good job of explaining it. I hope I kind of explained the financial crisis. I got most of that from the movie. It's really the first thing that tried to simplify it, and whenever like it was obviously something no one would understand, they would poke fun at it. So overall, I say it's a good movie. I'd recommend going to see it. This is Argent signing out.